So I think we'll get started in that I have, as always, a few slides to get through in recognizing our sponsors and all those wonderful introductions that need to be made. So hopefully we'll have more people join us as we get through this. So as many of you know, I believe you're all familiar with the Community Design Center. My name is Maria Furgiuele. I'm the Executive Director, and I want to welcome you to joining us in this very important community conversation. If you are not familiar with the Community Design Center, please visit our website at Community Design Center, cdcrochester.org, to learn more about the work that we do. I'd like to recognize Home Leasing as our sponsor for the series. We're truly grateful for Home Leasing's commitment to the entire series and for their very generous support for the last 5 years. We gratefully acknowledge the ESL Charitable Foundation for their generous support of the series, as well as the Community Preservation Corporation for being a gold level sponsor. I'd like to thank the Greater Rochester Association of Realtors for being our presenting sponsor for both the lecture and this community conversation. The GRAR has been a great support of many of our projects throughout the years. And I'd like to recognize all of our bronze sponsors. We're particularly grateful to Reconnect Rochester, the City of Rochester, and Heveron and Company. WXXI is our exclusive media sponsor, and we'd like to thank AIA Rochester as well as ASLA and AICP for being the continuing education sponsors. As you can see, we have many community organizations, firms, and companies that support our work, and we are grateful for each and every one of you. This is also an opportunity for us to recognize some of the people who are behind the scenes, particularly Monica Reifenstein, who is our wizard, makes everything happen, and our lecture planning committee, as well as our board of directors. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Circle of Friends. Our Circle of Friend members are persons or businesses that have made a commitment of sustained support to our organization. We gratefully acknowledge their support, and we extend an invitation to any of you who value the work of the Community Design Center to join our circle. And I would like to recognize and thank the New York State Council of the Arts, who has made our work possible through their generous support for the past 16 years. And now I'm pleased that Reverend Myra Brown could join us today. She's a local activist and the pastor of Spiritus Christi Church. This is an informal conversation, so I will let you, Reverend Brown, introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. I am the pastor of Spiritus Christi and an activist pastor. I also founded a racial justice and anti-racism coalition within the church, and we've been doing racial justice work and really anti-oppression work since 2006, sorry. And I'm very interested in the concept of building a just city, because that really is the work of anti-racism and anti-oppression. And so I am so excited to be part of this discussion. Rochester has a long history of needing to think about atonement and healing and how we rebuild trust and reconciliation, and really look at all of our processes and our structures for how we make people whole. And so I'm just absolutely thrilled to be part of this and to be part of a discussion with people who just understand the importance of kicking these cans up the road a bit, and thinking about how we might show up differently to create a better world. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Reverend Brown. Thinking differently, I think that's a really important concept to understand, because for so long we've been doing what we do in what we believe are well-meaning ways. But I think this presentation really what I really appreciated about this presentation was it really took us kind of behind the scenes to understand more the experience of the people whose lives we are trying to impact in a positive way, and recognizing that as well-meaning as we may be, we're not always doing the right thing. I'm curious to know from the presentation, what in particular, were there points in particular that stood out with you? Was there a key takeaway that you want to start the conversation around?
Yeah, you know, there were so many. I loved, you know, her challenge to us. You know, the challenges around the frameworks that are used, that the frameworks we use for doing the work of city planning and city making and environmental planning matters, right? The assumptions that are there, the ways in which we move about in terms of space. When she talks about, you know, spatial racism, without understanding kind of what, how that feels for communities of color, and her call really for us to understand the historical context by which we do our work, because that's where the acknowledgments are. Like she talked a lot about, we have to acknowledge the historical harm, right? And we have to be willing to make atonement for that. We have to be willing to look at the ways in which we've constructed ourselves and we move about in the effort of, you know, city making, that really excludes people and, you know, and really disengages them, right? Because of that, those experiences of harm that communities are left with, and feeling like that they only are seen if they are publicly bleeding out. Like, I think that just sort of touched into me in a very painful, kind of hard way, of really calling us to the work of seeing each other's humanity, even in the ways in which we do the work of trying to build up our cities. That it's really important that we have kind of one eye behind us to understand the history that we're bringing with us in that work, because we all carry our histories in our bodies and we all carry our own racial identities, and both of those things impact what we're trying to do together. So I think I really appreciated her making those connections, especially given that Rochester has a pretty long history itself of acknowledgments around how we have become city makers in terms of housing policies, right? Redlining and urban renewal, you know, and there's so many, employment. Like Rochester has a very long history. And so I was left just kind of thinking about, you know, what do we have left to acknowledge? You know, where is our work of atonement for our own history? And what will it take for us to see the suffering and the grief of people who've had to live with that history without redress, or even having it articulated as an acknowledged historical pain?
Yeah, I found it, as we were speaking a little bit before we went live, in going through the presentation again, it was so powerful. Every kind of slide and every statement she made had tremendous value and great impact. And as you're talking about, for me as a white person, to understand the very opening with her showing of that painting, and just saying how that we as white people have these prerequisites for judging people of color. And she was so spot on that, you know, we had to have bear witness to their suffering before we would believe that suffering existed. And most importantly, that despite seeing all of these things, despite having all this evidence, they still had to prove that they were acceptable citizens before all that. Yeah. And that was really powerful in the sense that it is really so true. We always say, oh, that person, for whatever reason, had it coming to them for whatever reason, because we feel that need to justify, and that's truly, truly unfortunate. She made a statement that said, the more we speak in ways that affirm the conditions associated with race, the worse our condition will get. And I found that really, really amazing that she's used this concept for centering her work. Do you have any comments about that?
I'm sorry, say that line again. The
more we speak in ways that affirm the conditions associated with race, the worse our condition will get.
Yeah.
So she follows that up with, if we are at a point in this nation's history where when witnessing the open suffering of Black people, you have to understand that it is much more grave than you think it is, which is also another part of that prerequisite. The fact that we're recognizing, we're seeing people suffering, and we have to really understand that it is just the tip of that iceberg, and we have to recognize that there is so much more behind that suffering that we don't see and that we're not aware of.
Absolutely. I mean, it has not historically been safe for us as people of color, right, to put all of our suffering in the public square, because it has been dangerous, right, for us. And so, we've carved out spaces within our community to be able to unmask in that way, because it's a safe space. And so I really could resonate, with her in that. So that's why when she says, whatever you sing in the public isn't the full shot, right? It isn't the full shot. It is just what we need to bring to it as kind of the awakening that something is really, really wrong here. And something really, really needs to change here. But those public spaces have never been fully trusting spaces for us. Again, because of the history that we as people of African descent bring to those spaces that diminished us, that reduced our access, that blocked our full participation, right? While expecting us to celebrate the little that we were given, right? Because others who looked like us didn't get the little that we got, right? In fact, there were other, Black people and people of color who weren't even let in the door, right? And so as people of color, we learn to reach deep within, right? To stand your dignity up, just to survive the trauma, to remind yourself that you're not less than. And just because you're not allowed in certain spaces, it doesn't mean that you don't belong in them equally as those who are welcomed in. And so I so resonate with that. Like, that is our truth, right? It is why, in Black and brown spaces, we talk so much about resilience, because that's what resilience looks like.
I invite any of you in the audience to share some of the key takeaways that you got out of the presentation, or any comments that you'd like to make. You're all in for just a listening ride?
I mean, no, I think we need to be more courageous than that. Hi, Reverend Brown. My name is Tanya. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Tanya. Good to meet you too.
I am a spiritist lurker, so I've seen seen you for years, and
yeah.
I really appreciate you giving us your time today. I really appreciate how you showed up for our community last year, citywide.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just reflecting on the space and time that we need to give for this conversation. To me, it feels like, I think what I know from grief is that it has its own timeline. And I think what I'm sitting here concerned about is that this grief is so large and so long and so deep that, and as I reflect on grief that I've had in my own life and how it takes its own there's no rushing it. Like anger can be a flash and it can be over and then you move on. But grief is not like that. And it needs time and it needs space and it needs other people, in my opinion, to acknowledge the grief. You can't really grieve alone. You need other people. So I think what I'm wrestling with is how to create that space in our communities. And for background, I'm trained as a city planner. Public engagement is my work and my passion. And I think a lot of times we show up to projects and we want to just like get to work and draw something and build something. And that there's not enough listening ever. But I think particularly when we're talking about, looking back and atonement, there needs to be so much more space created for that. And that's not to say that everyone showing up is going to want to participate in that. But I think that's what I show up today wrestling with is the depth of the grief, how to create that space, knowing that it could take forever, this grief.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I think what I heard Dr. Thomas say, and I agree with her, was she gave a starting place, right, of acknowledgement, right? And so, I don't know that you can even get to necessarily creating space for grief processing unless you come in acknowledging with the people where the pain is. Like, what part of the history that's connected to what you're doing, right, is still giving them pain, right? And so
Right.
I really appreciated that as a starting place, because I think about, I have a group and we're working on fundraising to install a civil rights heritage site to tell the story of the Black freedom struggle. And, part of the community organizing work for us was we went door to door and we talked to people about their history around being able to tell their story. Like, who gets to tell your story? How have you heard it being told? Was it sufficient? Is there a voice in the Black community that needs to be unmuted, right, and unscripted and unsurveilled to tell that story? Tell me about that. And is it important for us to put and to put forth work, right, to create an outdoor civil rights heritage park where you get to tell your story unmuted in that way? And so we were trying to create and start with a process of acknowledgement, right? We understood that we mute some voices in this community around racial justice and civil rights, and we unmute others that are much more palatable. And so I think that's what I heard her say, is that I think we have to go in and ask the people, what is it that we need to collectively acknowledge here before we begin to do this work? Is that helpful?
Yeah. And it's a question. It's not, it's an inquiry.
Sure.
And then an acknowledgement, like asking, what do we need to acknowledge? That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Tanya. So often we as a culture, as an American culture, have a very short memory. And so it's very, very convenient to say, oh, this happened, and then you move on. But this has been happening for so long, and it has come to the point where it can't, even if we wanted to, for those people who still need validation, that you can't ignore it. And we must start at the very foundation of at least recognizing the history and acknowledging it. When she was talking about, Richard, you had a question about the memorial.
I didn't want to take aerospace. That's why I put it in
Go,
chat.
go ahead, ask the question.
I remember hearing years ago through Sean that there was, because I raised it, was there a recognition of the location that sparked the uprising in '64? Is that, are you looking into the 7th Ward and Joseph Avenue? Is that where this project is based?
Yes, so the project is built to happen at Baden Park, which is actually the community where the uprising happened. You know, and we heard both things, right? We heard some resistance from communities that said, wait a minute, we had businesses on Joseph Avenue and people destroyed our businesses. And we had people from the Black community saying, but yeah, you know, we supported those businesses. It was our dollars, right, that supported those businesses. And yet we didn't, as Black people in that community, weren't necessarily being raised up economically, right? They were investing and they were in relationship with folks, but there was an economic racialized injustice that left Black folks and brown folks right where they were, as if they were enjoying that level of participation and had no aspirations for anything more, which we know was not true because the uprisings happened. And so I don't know that we have still yet, right, to have whole conversations among the communities that were impacted around the uprisings of '64 to just settle how we move forward to tell those stories. And the reality that, you know, we don't talk about it, but, you know, our city has punished that community ever since '64 in a lack of investment, right? And a lack of engagement and participation in the ways that we have invested and and allowed access and participation in other parts of our community in terms of what we build up, when we build it up, and how much resources we put into those communities. But we don't talk about that, right? We just call them, you know, dangerous communities, and you know, and then we focus someplace else. I mean, I think they're starting to, you know, First Genesis, I think, started building some apartments there, and so there's some reviving that's happening. But gosh, look how long that took.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
I found, I think the statement that Dr. Thomas made very, very powerful and very relevant is, if you relegate Black people to some equity exercise, and you know, for the work that we do, I mean, I was struck by this. Some charity version of the aspirational whiteness that is the built environment. We are supposed to celebrate that and love it the way that everyone that loves their normative access to space and mobility. So exactly that recognition that, you know, the expectation that we have of people of color is they should, you know, give them a little something, they should be happy, and we have to be just much more aware of the fact that, number one, that aspirational whiteness is part of our culture and community in urban planning and city making. First and foremost, one of the primary recognitions that we, I think, need to acknowledge.
Absolutely. I mean, I was having a conversation recently with one of the artists, and, you know, there's a lot of money in this community that goes into art, right? But it's mostly white-led art organizations that really walk away with the lion's share of resources to do their work. And so there was a group of artists of color who were left out of those resources. And I think the county legislator put forth a proposal or a bill to vote to include some of those artists of color. And my understanding is that there's all of a sudden this big tension and conflict with the county and these legislators, because, you know, our county executive feels like that they didn't do that right. This, you know, and the people, they have questions about this organization and that organization. But the very fact that there had to be an alternative funding source created that is separate, right, for Black and Brown artistic organizations, and that's in a different budget source than the budget source that's in organizations for white-led artistic organizations, right? That in and of itself is a problem. Like, why did we have to even to do that? Except it was done because, you know, it was determined that this group of people of color were left out, right? Were left out of those resources that they should never have been left out of, right? So were they an afterthought? Right? Like, where were they on the priority list? Were they on the priority list? Was the system waiting for them to say, hey, don't forget about me, ooh, 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 pick me, right? All those ways in which we as people of color have to position ourselves, right? Which keeps saying to us, question whether you belong, question whether you belong, question whether you're entitled to this, question whether you're equal, right? And so I think there are these ways that she's right, that we've sort of normalized these processes that forces people of color to kick the door in, right? To knock on the window, right? To peek through the keyhole and see if anybody's home that I can talk to let them know that I'm out here. And, you know, what I took away from her conversation is that we are so much better than that. Like, you know, it does require that we're willing to do this sort of turnaround and reevaluate and reassess how we're moving about in the world, in our processes, in our policies, in our practices. Who are we thinking of? You know, how much are we seeing? You know, are we thinking about the people who are impacted being at those tables of decision? I love how she said, you know, she created kind of this model where they give away their knowledge, right, to community members so that they can have a seat at the table of power and be able to participate, right, in city planning, right? And so they're equipping people with what they need so that they might participate. And I love how she got her first job. She's like, you know, I don't know what SEQA is, but I can Google it, right? I'm like a Google queen. Like, I Google everything, right? You know, when I needed to learn how to fix the brakes on my car, I went straight to Google. Like, let me find a good video. I think I can do this, right? And so, but what was discovered in that story she told was what traditionally in white frameworks would have seen her as not having the capacity, right, was shattered, because all she needed was a shot, right, to actually live into the capacity that could never really be discovered until she was given a chance. And I think that's what we have to undo in the ways that we currently operate.
So that's a wonderful comment, and I'm wondering, I'm thinking, you know, you are doing this amazing work within your organization. We are trying to do similar work, and I'm wondering, how do we find our partners and engage each other in a way that can help us to create this space to really open up the doors and allow for opportunities. I know in one respect, one of the things we've been exploring is, you know, being able to hire a summer intern, person of color, to learn about the work that we do and hopefully, you know, have some education around it that will help inspire them to continue in that work. But one of the foundational problems we have is there are so many few people in the design fields. You know, it's such an exclusively white male dominated field. So I'm thinking with the community work that we do, you know, if we start to engage children in allowing them to dream of the possibility of them doing this work, you know, that architecture is something they can do, that city building. I love the fact that she used the term city building as opposed to urban planner.
Yes, I
that anybody can be a city builder, and you didn't need specific expertise. So my question to you is, do you know of other organizations that are engaged in this work? And is there a way that we can collaborate together to share resources and hopefully facilitate this happening in a little bit faster than it's going?
Yeah. So let me just first say something about the history of African American people that I think might influence how you might think about partners. When we think about, expertise, I think you're right, that it's mostly white males kind of in the field. But one of the things I think that is unique about African Americans in particular, right, on American soil, is because we were blocked from access to certain fields of learning and education and being able to have entrance, right, into these particular specific fields. African Americans in this country had to take up learning the formal things from a very informal place. Mm-hmm. And I think that they have proven that they can be just as capable as the folks who have had access to the formal learning around these things, yes. Right? So you think about, the African Americans, who learned medicine by just picking up the books, in the enslaver's house, right? Mm-hmm. African Americans who learned, how to build railroads, right? How to do engineering work by watching and having somebody share the knowledge and kind of paying attention. So I happen to think that there is a built-in inherent capacity that mm-hmm. African Americans have, regardless of what we put in our job descriptions for requirements, because I think that we've been hardwired to learn these things in ways that other groups of folks have not had to, right? Because of our specific history of oppression in the U.S., we've had to learn to become nurses, right? Without Clara Barton. Right. And so we did those things, we learned the home remedies, and we learned what the medical system was doing in order to make sure that our folks survived. So that's kind of a long way to say that the first thing I would do is I wouldn't necessarily be looking through traditional frameworks to answer that question. I would find somebody who's smart, who is a quick learner, who kind of like, Dr. Thomas, who says, you know what, I can learn whatever it is that, you need me to learn. So I am now running a parish, right, with over $1 million budget. Had I ever done that before? I became pastor, the new pastor, and did it? No. I ran a $70,000 budget prior to that. But you know what? I'm smart. Right? I have capacity. I have intellect. I'm able to go to the sources that I need to learn. I have a team. I know how to, delegate and go to my team and learn from my team and have them learn from me and realize that I don't have to have it all. Right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the beauty of it. When you have a team, you don't have to have it all. And you have a team. So I would reach out. Really, there are lots of organizations in this city who one of the groups would be, to check in with, who would have I think a number of resources would be the Black Agenda Group, mm-hmm. right? I think they would be very much tied into other Black and Brown organizations. The Avenue Black Box Theater, artists have very creative minds around. What city building can and should look like. And they're incredibly smart and wonderful folks. I'm not connected with a whole lot of those organizations just because, I often have my head down, kind of doing the work. But yeah, I think Rochester has a plethora probably of organizations and people of color who would be sufficient. I think it's important to just keep thinking about how do I share the knowledge and the resources that I have. You know, I spend my life thinking about that in all the spaces that I'm in. You know, if I run across a mother who is a single mother who has a child and they don't have family supports, and they come to me, I'm thinking about, all right, I have some knowledge, I have some resources, I have some things that I've learned, and I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to share that with your child and to give you everything that I have to make sure that when you walk away, and you know, when that time comes that we may or may not be in each other's lives in this way, that you have so much more than how you started with, that you'll make it. You'll make it and you'll do well. And then hopefully you'll then share that knowledge and those resources that you now have with the next person, right? Who needs somebody to walk with them, right? Who needs a hand up. So I think, you know, we're so protective of the knowledge that we have and the information that we have. We're so scared somebody's going to take our place. And I think we have to put off that fear of that kind of fear. I don't think it serves us. I think there's so much room, right, for all of us. Like, we're so unique that nobody could really replace us. And the knowledge that I give you may function very different in the circles you're in. The knowledge you give me may function very differently in the circles that I'm in. But it will help me, just as it will help you.
It seems like such a simple concept of you know, passing it on. Share what you have, and the fact that knowledge, it's a great reminder. The fact that knowledge could be utilized in so many different ways, even in ways that perhaps we didn't even realize ourselves. So the power behind that knowledge is leveraged even further. Any of you folks out there have any comments that you'd like to share about things that you learned through this presentation, or particular insights, or even if you're aware of any community resources that we might like to know more about? Richard?
Yeah, I found several things she said, Dr. Thompson or Thomas, I'm sorry.
Thomas.
That really struck with me in a way that I think were different for others. When she recounted her story of the first job, I was thinking, that's how it works in startup world. People in startup world are building and creating something new. I'm an entrepreneur. I dwell in the entrepreneurial world. You hire based on character, persistence, a bunch of things, not necessarily on degree. And it ties into her personal account of her PTSD and the story of her personal trauma. And as I get closer and closer with the community of African Americans and have been blessed with their candor and their stories, they all have an experience with the healthcare establishment. They all have experience with criminal justice that is alien to people that look like me and have the ability to grow up in suburbs with plenty. And so there's this inherent distrust in the system. And so I suggest basically CDCR is a small, scrappy organization. You know, think a little out of the box, be creative, and choose a person and be prepared to fail fast, fail cheap. That's an entrepreneurial, and there's nothing wrong with failure. Everyone will learn from it. Yeah. So that's the type of risk mentality an entrepreneur has. But again, on her story, just the revelations, I didn't realize that Breonna Taylor was basically set up. And that so was Dr. Thomas when she was living in Oakland with that no-knock entrance. And no wonder it's hard for us urbanists, I'm now becoming an urbanist, to keep insisting on a...
You're muted, Richard. Richard, you're muted. We can't hear you.
Sorry, you lost your audio.
You hear me?
Yeah,
there you go. You're back.
So basically, just like it's hard to find someone with design or architectural experience, that's someone perpetuating a system because they have the degree and they want people that look like them. And that, you know, the urbanists, even though we have a different language, we're perpetuating a process that might be the people in the community around Parcel 5, why aren't we getting a diverse group engaged? Because there's a tremendous amount of distrust. So honoring it and respecting it can perhaps foster a dialogue. And I don't have the answers, but I'm willing to go there because it's very important.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Some of it may have to do with where the invitation um, to discuss Parcel 5 is going. Like I think about, Antioch Baptist Church and First Genesis, right? Those churches have been very involved in conversations and dialogue with the Black and Brown community um, around issues with Rock Acts and racial justice. They're a partner with us in the Civil Rights Heritage Site. But what would it look like to go into the Black community and host a discussion at the Black church about Parcel 5? And what would be your vision? What would you like to see? So sometimes it's even the spaces that we invite people in to have certain discussions, right? And so it is that sort of thinking outside of the box of going to where the people are. We started to change our strategies at Spiritus Christi in terms of, we have our outreaches, and so people certainly come to us in outreaches, but we also have a part of outreach where we take our racial justice team to the people and to the community, and we go over and over again. We go every summer. We go when the weather's good. We go in the fall when it's cold. We knock on doors and we offer people gift cards to purchase their Thanksgiving dinners. We don't ask them to come and pick them up at the church. Now there is a program that people can do that, but that isn't the only way that we make our footprint into the community. Yep, there's a group that, they come in and they can pick up their gift cards. And then there's the group of us that go out there and we knock on the doors and say, hey, we're from Spiritus Christi and we just want to be out here to help you make sure that you can have a good meal for you and your family. And we have some gift cards that were donated to us and we'd like to share them with you. Would that be all right? Right? And then we go back out again for Christmas. We had a donor this past fall who donated some money for struggling families, and we had some gift cards, and so we were able to go through the community. We came upon a family with 5 kids, a young mother, and so we knew that she actually needed the cash in addition to the card. And so you're kind of meeting people where they are. We didn't have sort of this rigid process that we were going to do. We're going to be guided really by the Spirit and guided by wisdom, right? And guided by the needs that were in front of us. And I think you have to allow for that fluidity in the ways in which we do particular things, and I think it goes back to when she talks about having a lens of dignity, right, that overlays it all. I think about when I was a child, right? My family we moved about 5 times when I was a kid. And we moved because the structures that we lived in really were uninhabitable. And we lived them in as long as we could until they got condemned. And then we moved into a different place until that got condemned. We had sewer rats that would come out of the sewer and come into our house. And, my brothers had to get BB guns just to keep the rats out of the house. And then we got cats and eventually, the gist of it was that this is the city, right, where those things happened to us. And so when Richard talks about, we have these experiences with healthcare systems. We not only have the experiences with, healthcare systems and criminal justice systems. We've had experiences with housing systems that didn't care whether or not my mother had, 8 kids living in these houses that put us at risk. And then, we had welfare systems that required that Black fathers get out of the house if there was any hope for Black mothers to get any resources to help her raise those children. So I have to lose my father in order to have some food on the table. Like, Black people didn't create those kinds of systems, right? But this is kind of what she's talking about. And she talks about these systems being put on us And then down the road, when the system actors change their mind, right, then they point backwards to that community and go, look at those people, look how they're trying to beat the system, and look how they're, um, that just won't work. They just won't look at where are their fathers, right? Because the memory is short. But I remember having to go hide my father's stuff every time the welfare people came to do a check. I remember, I mean, we didn't play the game. We hid my daddy, but we didn't put him out. But a lot of families did, right? Because their kids needed to eat. They didn't have anything. And so they did what they needed. They sacrificed members of their family. And so when we talk about historical harm, right? This is what I know that has happened in this community. There's a list of things that we need to acknowledge and atone for in our own community as we do our work around creating a more just city.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That led me to think about another really powerful statement that is related, in that nobody owes you buy-in into your innovations. The whole concept that we even, as well-meaning community builders and urban planners expect that, we know what the trends are. We know that streets should be two-way. We know that bike lanes should be implemented to allow for a transit option, but we rarely recognize the fact that the community may receive these things or perceive these things differently. So when she made the statement that nobody owes you buy-in to your innovation or your exciting open streets concept or al fresco dining, so it says it's not your job to, your work is not to convince them not to be. People are allowed to be skeptical of those things. Your work is not to convince them not to be skeptical, but your work is to get rid of the systems that sowed the seeds of skepticism. So that is so true, that we have to look at the systemic issues as community builders and planners and really start to hopefully try to dismantle them, or at least choose to operate differently. And fortunately, small organizations like ours and perhaps other community organizations like yours have the flexibility to be more agile. So that's one of the things that we can intentionally do, is to look to operate differently.
Yeah, I mean, it takes courage in being thought leaders, right, around this, and I think it can be a heavy lift, right, as you begin to be kind of a larger organization. But I would have to say I think it's a doable lift, right, mm-hmm. because it simply requires that we're willing to lead in organizations around the conversation of, perhaps we need to really look at our policies and our practices and its impact on a diverse group of folks, not just the white folks who designed it, right? Mm-hmm. Who thought about it, who put it together, right? Whether well-intentioned or not, like there's always sort of this hidden impact. So I think you need courage and thought leaders who are always willing to check in and be ready really for the pushback, right? I remember when our church decided to have a gospel choir, like white people pushed back and said, why do we have to do that? We don't have that many Black people in our church, right? And that music is kind of too loud. Like, it's not worship. Like, and so in that, you had a white framework for deciding like what was worship, what was appropriate, right? What should be mainstream, right? What should be backstream, and all of those things. And so, the leaders at the time, Father Jim and Reverend Mary, decided, you know what? And they said this to the people, which I thought was brave. They said, if we had one Black person in the church, that would be enough reason to do it. And I think that's the kind of courage and leadership, right, and thought leadership that needs to happen if we're going to reverse some of these processes and take down some of these systems that are causing the harm and the oppression. Like, we have to remind people that we can absolutely do this together. Like, we are a collective family, and it calls us on us to do collective work, and to be brave, right? And to trust the unknown. Like, we don't know, right? We know we can work together and do some stuff, but shucks, we might stumble upon, the thing that creates an amazing new model, that brings healing and wholeness, to all the people. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think that when you're a smaller organization, you have more pliability and flexibility, but I think larger organizations can build that in to their structures as well.
Ed? No, you're muted.
Better?
That's better.
I think this is a very important topic. Marie, you asked earlier the difficulty of finding an intern. And my sense is this goes beyond just finding an intern. This is, how can we be helpful? How can the design center be helpful in the entire community? And a lot of community development is taking place now. And how prepared are we for that participation? And I'd be interested, Myra, in ways in which you see that the organization could be helpful in that process.
So I'm sorry, Ed, so your question was about the design center, how the design center could better facilitate community engagement in the planning process that we are currently exploring, particularly with Interloop, or in general?
Well, can we be more effective? We've done a lot of talking around the problems with the systems that need to be broken down, but there's a lot of community development work that is going on right now. And I don't know what kind of participation is taking place and how my mind started to work when you said you're having difficulty finding an intern, and spreading an understanding of community building throughout the communities that are being rebuilt. And
I appreciate that question. I'm sorry, Ed, were you?
No, go ahead.
So I appreciate that question. One of the things that we're doing, right, with the that we're working on with the Black Community Focus Fund and a couple of our couple of funders is we're working to put together actually a paid internship work program, and we will be actually looking for partners who will say, I will take some interns from the Black and Brown community. And so we're in the early stages of kind of designing what that looks like, but we're hoping to have a 7-year program that one of our funders has committed to. So we absolutely have people in the community who could benefit from that. What we need is organizations that say, I'm in, I'll participate in that, right?
Got me in.
Awesome. And so, yeah, I think be available to open the doors, to welcome the people, to partner with us to make sure that people have access and they have the skills and the knowledge, right, that we're willing to pass on and to walk with them. I think these are I like to call them wisdom opportunities, right? These are wisdom walks with people in our community. And what I love about that work is that for me, it feels eternal in that it really goes beyond the lives that we live. Like, what we pass on takes on a life of its own. And then when that gets passed on, it takes on a life of its own. And we're really investing into future generations and generations that will come after them. Like, we're starting a new pattern, a new practice of how we show up for each other's humanity, how we show up to support each other's dignity, how we show up to right the wrongs of the past that we are fully ready to acknowledge, and to turn the tide and do something about that.
Well, thank you, Reverend, for those comments. We're coming up on the hour, so I think that is a wonderful note to close on. I want to thank you especially for taking the time to join us today, and obviously a fair amount of preparation and being involved with listening to the presentation last week and spending the time and sharing your wisdom with us today. So I thank you so much. I thank all of you who took the time today to join us and having this important conversation. I just have a few closing slides, but I want you to please be aware of our upcoming lecture a month from now, or I believe 3 weeks from now, I apologize. We will be having June Grant, who is the principal at Blink Lab, joining us in June. I apologize, I can't see the slides, but we look forward to a wonderful closing presentation to the lecture series. And of course, we'll have a follow-up conversation to that. And as we are also planning to start our Placemaking 101 series, so in the fall. So we look forward to having Reverend Myra Brown be one of our presenters for Placemaking 101. And we will continue this conversation, hopefully at home with our colleagues and friends. Also, I invite you to please take part in the survey or share the survey with those of you, people in your network, so that we can gather some feedback about our programming. I am so grateful to you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.